A cop arrested a homeless woman, but her son's secret shocked everyone. What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned until the end to uncover the unbelievable truth behind this emotional story. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters. The small town of Maple Ridge was known for its quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and an air of unshakable normalcy. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. But beneath its surface, Maple Ridge held secrets, and on a brisk autumn morning, one of those secrets began to unravel in a way no one could have foreseen. Officer Dan Carter was doing his routine patrol when he spotted a woman huddled near the entrance of a small bakery. Her clothes were worn and tattered, her hair unkempt, and her face showed signs of exhaustion. Beside her sat a shopping cart stuffed with blankets, clothes, and a few personal belongings. She was clearly homeless, a sight that had become increasingly rare in the pristine town. Dan had seen her before. She'd been lingering around the park and sleeping under the gazebo. Her presence had stirred whispers among the townsfolk, most of whom viewed her as a blemish on their otherwise idyllic community. This morning, she seemed to be arguing with the bakery owner, who was gesturing animatedly toward the street. "All right, ma'am, that's enough," Dan said, stepping out of his cruiser and approaching the scene. His tone was firm, but not unkind. "You're causing a disturbance." The woman looked up at him with tired, defiant eyes. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said, her voice hoarse. "I just wanted a little warmth. Is that a crime?" Dan sighed. He had a job to do, and as much as he sympathized with her plight, he couldn't ignore the complaints. "Come on, let's go," he said, taking her arm gently but firmly. "We'll talk somewhere else." Reluctantly, the woman allowed herself to be led to the patrol car. As Dan helped her into the back seat, she muttered under her breath, "You people don't understand." "What don't we understand?" Dan asked, genuinely curious. The woman didn't answer. She simply stared out the window as they drove away, her expression a mixture of resignation and quiet determination. Dan brought her to the station, where she was booked for loitering and disturbing the peace. As he filled out the paperwork, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Homelessness wasn't common in Maple Ridge, and something about this woman felt out of place. "Name?" Dan asked as he sat across from her in the interrogation room. "Claire," she said after a pause. "Claire Harper. Do you have any family we can contact?" At this, Claire's eyes hardened. "No," she said curtly. "There's no one." Dan studied her for a moment. Her hands were calloused, her nails dirty. She looked like someone who had been through more than her share of hardships. "All right, Claire," he said finally. "You're free to go, but you can't keep hanging around the bakery." She nodded, but didn't move to leave. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think I'm just some nobody, don't you? A homeless woman with no story?" Dan frowned. "I never said that." "No, but it's what you're thinking," Claire said, her tone sharp. "Well, I'm not nobody. I have a son, and if you knew who he was, you wouldn't be looking at me like this." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Who's your son?" Claire hesitated, her jaw tightening as if she were debating whether or not to answer. Finally, she said, "His name is Ethan. Ethan Harper." The name sparked something in Dan's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "Why does that name sound familiar?" he asked. Claire gave a humorless laugh. "Because everyone knows Ethan Harper," she said bitterly. "You've probably seen his face on the news. My son, he's a hero." Dan's stomach dropped as the realization hit him. Ethan Harper was a decorated firefighter, celebrated for his bravery during a devastating wildfire that had made national headlines the previous year. He'd saved countless lives and had become a symbol of courage and resilience. But how could the mother of such a revered figure end up on the streets, completely forgotten? Dan. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Dan asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Claire's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Because it doesn't matter," she said. "No one cares about the mother of a hero. They only care about the hero." "Ethan Harper's mother?" Dan repeated later, sitting in the station's break room with his partner, Officer Jenna Morales. "That's what she said," Dan replied. "I didn't believe it at first, but when I looked her up in the system, it checked out. She's telling the truth." Jenna frowned, her brow furrowed in thought. "But why is she homeless? Ethan's got money, doesn't he? Why wouldn't he help her?" "That's the part I can't figure out," Dan admitted. "It doesn't add up." Determined to find answers, Dan decided to dig deeper. He reached out to Ethan Harper's public relations team, hoping to confirm Claire's story and perhaps understand why she had fallen through the cracks. The response he received was unexpected. "We have no comment on Ethan Harper's personal life," the representative said curtly, "and we respectfully ask that you respect his privacy." Undeterred, Dan decided to take matters into his own hands. He arranged a meeting with Ethan, hoping to bridge the gap and understand the rift between him and his mother. Dan drove to the fire station where Ethan Harper worked, his mind racing with questions. Ethan had become a household name after his heroic actions, and Dan couldn't reconcile the image of the brave, selfless firefighter with the neglect his mother seemed to have endured. Something about the situation felt off, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. When Dan arrived, he was greeted by a bustling scene. Firefighters were checking equipment and preparing for the day's drills. It didn't take long for him to spot Ethan, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a confident stride and an easy smile that instantly lit up the room. He was exactly as the news had portrayed him, charismatic and approachable. Dan approached him cautiously. "Ethan Harper?" he asked. Ethan turned, his expression curious but welcoming. "That's me. Can I help you? I'm Officer Dan Carter. I wanted to talk to you about your mother, Claire Harper." The smile faded from Ethan's face, replaced by a guarded look. "What about her?" he asked, his tone noticeably cooler. Dan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I arrested her for loitering earlier this week. She told me she's your mother, and I wanted to confirm that. More importantly, I wanted to understand why she's homeless. She says you haven't been in contact with her." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms defensively. "She's my mother, but that doesn't mean I'm responsible for her choices," he said bluntly. Dan blinked, caught off guard by the harshness of Ethan's response. "I don't mean to pry," he said, "but she's living on the streets. It's hard to understand how someone with your resources could let that happen." Ethan sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I don't expect you to understand, but my mother, she's not who you think she is. She's made mistakes, big ones. I've tried to help her, but every time I do, she pushes me away. She's always been stubborn, always wanted to do things her way." Dan studied Ethan carefully. There was pain in his voice, but also frustration and anger. It was clear that the relationship between Ethan and Claire was far more complicated than he had initially thought. "What kind of mistakes?" Dan asked gently. Ethan hesitated, his gaze distant as if he were replaying painful memories. "She was an alcoholic," he admitted finally. "When I was growing up, she'd disappear for days at a time. Sometimes I didn't know if she'd come back at all. I had to fend for myself, make my own meals, figure out how to survive. It wasn't until I was older that I realized just how bad things were." Dan nodded, his heart heavy. "But she's not drinking now," he pointed out. "She seems clear-headed. If she's trying to turn her life around, maybe this is an opportunity to rebuild your relationship." Ethan shook his head. "I've tried, officer. I've reached out, offered to pay for her rehab, even set her up in an apartment once, but it always ends the same way. She pushes me away. She says she doesn't want my pity or my money. At some point, you have to stop trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Dan was quiet for a moment, letting Ethan's words sink in. It was a perspective he hadn't considered, and it complicated the narrative he had built in his mind. But there was still something nagging at him, a feeling that there was more to the story. "If it's not too much to ask," Dan said, "would you be willing to come see her? Just talk to her? Maybe this time things will be different." Ethan hesitated, his expression conflicted. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'll think about it." That evening, Dan returned to the station and found Claire sitting quietly in the corner of the holding cell. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. When she saw Dan, her face lit up with a faint glimmer of hope. "Did you talk to him?" she asked. "I did," Dan replied. "He told me about the struggles you've both faced. He said he's tried to help you, but you've pushed him away. Is that true?" Claire's expression darkened, and she looked down at her hands. "It's not as simple as he makes it sound," she said quietly. "I've made mistakes, yes, but I had my reasons." "What reasons?" Dan pressed. "Help me understand." Claire took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "I wasn't always like this. I was a good mother once, or at least I tried to be. But then Ethan's father left us. He drained our bank account, left me with nothing. I did my best to hold it together, but I wasn't strong enough. I turned to alcohol to numb the pain, and it nearly destroyed me. But I never stopped loving my son. Never." Her voice cracked and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "When Ethan got older, he wanted to help me, but I didn't want to be a burden to him. I pushed him away because I didn't want him to see me like this. I thought maybe it was better if he remembered me as the mother I used to be, not the mess I've become." Dan felt a pang of sympathy for Claire. Her story was heartbreaking, but it also made him wonder if there was a way to bridge the gap between her and Ethan. "Claire," he said gently, "if you could say one thing to Ethan, what would it be?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I'd tell him I'm sorry," she said, "and that I love him more than anything in this world." Dan couldn't get Claire's words out of his head. Her vulnerability, her regret, it painted a picture far more complex than the one Ethan had shared. He decided to visit Ethan again, determined to push a little harder. Maybe he could convince Ethan to meet his mother face to face and hear her out. The next day, Dan found Ethan working on a fire truck outside the station. He approached cautiously, not wanting to put the firefighter on the defensive. "Ethan," Dan called out. Ethan glanced over, wiping grease off his hands. "Officer Carter, didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I wanted to follow up," Dan said. "I spoke with your mother again. She told me more about her struggles, how your father leaving broke her. She regrets everything, Ethan. She said if she could tell you one thing, it's that she's sorry and that she loves you." Ethan stiffened, his jaw tightening. "It's not that simple," he said, his tone clipped. "I get that," Dan replied, "but people don't often get the chance to make things right. She's still your mother, and she's trying to rebuild. Don't you think she deserves the chance to explain herself?" Ethan sighed heavily, leaning against the truck. "You don't understand what it was like growing up with her," he said. "I used to come home from school not knowing if she'd be there. Sometimes she'd leave for days and come back smelling like a bar, acting like everything was fine. I had to grow up fast because she couldn't be a parent." Dan nodded. "I'm not here to dismiss your pain, Ethan. What you went through sounds incredibly difficult, but I've seen what happens when people hold on to anger for too long. It eats away at you. Meeting her might not fix everything, but it could be a step toward healing for both of you." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stared off into the distance, his expression unreadable. Finally, he let out a long breath. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's the best I can do right now." Back at the station, Claire was sitting on the edge of the cot in her holding cell, her hands clasped tightly together. When Dan entered, she looked up, her face etched with worry. "Did you talk to him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Dan replied. "He's still hesitant, but I think he's considering it. You have to give him time." Claire nodded slowly slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Time," she echoed. "It's all I've ever had, and yet I feel like I've wasted so much of it." Dan sat down across from her, the bars between them seeming more symbolic than physical. "What would you want to say to him if you could?" he asked. "I'd tell him the truth," Claire said, "that I was scared, that I didn't know how to be a single parent, that I made choices I regret every single day. But I'd also tell him how proud I am of him. I've watched from a distance, you know. I saw the news about his rescues, his awards. He's become such a strong, selfless man, despite everything I put him through." Dan felt a lump in his throat as he listened. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of empathy for Claire. She was a woman who had fallen, but she was trying to stand again. He hoped Ethan would see that too. Several days passed before Ethan finally decided to visit his mother. The encounter was tense from the moment he walked into the station. Ethan's tall frame and confident demeanor seemed almost too large for the small space, while Claire looked fragile and uncertain behind the bars of her cell. Dan stayed nearby, ready to intervene if the conversation turned sour, but he kept his distance to give them privacy. Ethan stood in front of the cell, his arms crossed. "Mom," he said, his voice neutral. Claire rose to her feet, her hands gripping the bars. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think you'd come." "Well, I'm here," he said. "What do you want to say?" Claire took a shaky breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "I want to say I'm sorry," she began, "for everything, for the times I wasn't there for you, for the pain I caused you. I was so consumed by my own grief and failures that I didn't see how much you needed me. And when you tried to help, I pushed you away because I was too ashamed to let you see how far I'd fallen." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening despite his best efforts to remain composed. "You could have reached out to me," he said. "You didn't have to go through this alone." "I know," Claire said, her voice breaking. "I was scared that you'd hate me, scared that I wasn't worth saving." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his emotions warring within him. Finally, he let out a long breath. "I don't hate you, Mom," he said quietly, "but it's hard to forget everything that happened." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," she said, "but I want to try. I want to fix this, Ethan. I just need a chance." Ethan hesitated before finally reaching through the bars and taking her hand. "We'll see," he said, "one step at a time. Continua. 40. Tu dijiste. Continua. ChatGPT Plus. ChatGPT. The station was quiet as Ethan and Claire shared that tentative, fragile moment of connection. Dan observed from a distance, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible for the two of them. After a few minutes, Ethan pulled his hand back, straightened up, and cleared his throat. "I need time, Mom," he said, his voice steadier now, "but I'll try. I can't promise anything beyond that." Claire nodded, her tears unabated. "That's all I ask," she whispered. "Just time to prove that I can do better." Ethan gave her a small nod before turning and walking away. As he passed Dan, he offered a brief glance, a silent acknowledgement of the officer's role in bringing them together. Then he was gone, leaving Claire alone once more, though this time her sorrow was mixed with a fragile sliver of hope. In the days that followed, Dan couldn't stop thinking about Claire and Ethan's story. He had seen countless people come through the system, many of whom were trapped in cycles of poverty, addiction, or violence. But something about Claire's determination to make amends and Ethan's inner struggle struck a chord with him. He decided to keep tabs on Claire after her release, ensuring she had access to resources that could help her rebuild her life. Claire, for her part, was true to her word. She started attending counseling sessions for her addiction and joined a local shelter program designed to help individuals reintegrate into society. It wasn't easy. Every day felt like an uphill battle, but she carried Ethan's tentative words of hope in her heart, using them as fuel to push forward. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself reflecting more and more on his mother's words. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, using his anger as a shield to protect himself from the pain of her abandonment. But now, those walls felt like they were cracking, letting in feelings he wasn't sure how to process. One evening, Ethan found himself at his fire station's kitchen table, staring at his phone. His colleagues were bustling around him, joking and preparing meals, but Ethan was lost in thought. Finally, he dialed Dan's number. "Officer Carter," Dan answered, surprised to hear from him. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to thank you for pushing me to talk to her." Dan smiled, though Ethan couldn't see it. "I didn't do much," he said. "You did the hard part." "Well, I'm still trying to figure out where to go from here," Ethan admitted, "but I'm glad I went." Dan nodded to himself. "Take it one day at a time. Healing doesn't happen overnight, but every small step matters." A few weeks later, Claire received an unexpected visitor at the shelter. She had been working in the kitchen, helping prepare dinner for the residents, when one of the volunteers told her someone was asking for her. Wiping her hands on a towel, she stepped into the hallway and froze. It was Ethan. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "Hey, Mom," he said softly. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to say. "Ethan," she whispered, What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see how you're doing," he said, his tone uncertain. I heard you've been working hard to turn things around." Claire nodded quickly, tears springing to her eyes. "I am," she said earnestly. "I'm trying so hard, Ethan. For you, for myself." Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. "I thought maybe we could talk," he said. "Really talk." Claire's hands trembled as she gestured to a small sit-in area nearby. "Of course," she said. "I'd love that." Their conversation lasted for hours. Ethan shared his memories of growing up, the pain he had carried for so long, and the moments when he had felt utterly abandoned. Claire, in turn, spoke about her struggles with depression and addiction, her shame, and her deep regret for not being there when he needed her most. By the end of the evening, there were no easy answers or perfect resolutions, but there was understanding, a fragile bridge being built between mother and son. Months passed, and while their relationship wasn't perfect, Claire and Ethan continued to rebuild. Ethan started visiting Claire regularly at the shelter, and when she eventually moved into transitional housing, he helped her furnish her small apartment. Slowly, trust began to grow where there had once been only pain. One day, Ethan invited Claire to a family day event at the fire station. She hesitated at first, unsure if she deserved to be part of his life in such a public way, but Ethan insisted. "You're my mom," he said, "and I want you there." When she arrived, Ethan introduced her to his colleagues with pride in his voice. Claire felt tears welling up as she realized just how far they had come. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. In the end, it wasn't a single moment that healed their relationship, but a series of small deliberate steps, a journey of forgiveness, redemption, and love. Claire found a renewed sense of purpose, using her experiences to mentor others at the shelter. Ethan, in turn, discovered that letting go of his anger allowed him to open his heart in ways he never thought possible. And through it all, Dan watched from the sidelines, quietly proud of the part he had played in helping two people find their way back to each other.